now let me introduce the first speaker of this conference. Roy Brown is the former president of the International Ethical and Humanist Union and currently the representative at the UN from the International Ethical and Humanist Union at the Human Rights Council. Mr. Brown has spoken on a number of subjects from female genital mutilation to witch hunts in Africa. In particular, he is a staunch defender of freedom of expression and works hard to keep religious groups at bay. Mr. Brown is one of the main reasons that what is now called the European Constitution does not have any reference to God, religion, or the alleged Christian roots of Europe. So thank you. I'm happy that Mr. Brown was able to join us here in Copenhagen, and it is an honor to let him open the Gods&Politics conference. Thank you.
Good morning, or is it afternoon? There are an estimated 1 billion atheists in the world, so I guess the rest of you are watching football. First of all, I must thank the Danish Atheist Society and the Atheist Alliance International for organizing this conference and for inviting me to open the proceedings. I take it as read that the title of this conference is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I'm sure everybody here knows that gods only exist in the minds of people. So what we'll be mainly discussing this weekend will not be gods exactly, but religion and its continuing and increasing influence on politics and public life. The history of Europe is the history of a long struggle of ordinary people to free themselves from oppression, oppression by their rulers and by religion. The Church fought the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of equality, democracy, and human rights every inch of the way. To see just how well the struggle for freedom has succeeded, imagine we were holding this conference 500 years ago, anywhere in Europe. There isn't a single one of us who would have escaped with our lives. When you next hear some religious leader sounding off about morality or Europe's moral compass, remember that when these people had power, you could be sentenced to death for failing to remove your hat when a religious procession passed by, or suffer house arrest for life for turning your telescope to the sky and reporting what you saw. Remember, too, that for centuries the Church supported the institution of slavery and opposed its abolition. For centuries, the Church vilified the Jews as Christ killers, and it was that Christian heritage that led directly to the Holocaust. Yet despite all this, and despite the great leaps we've made in our scientific knowledge that have falsified so many religious beliefs, the power and influence of religion actually seems to be increasing. How is this possible? Well, part of the answer, of course, is money, and money equals influence. In many European countries, including Germany, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, the government funds religion through the imposition of church taxes. The German church tax, for example, brings in over 8 billion euros to their coffers every year. And charity law across Europe has created the world's biggest tax haven. To live tax-free, all you need to do is register your operations as a religion or a religious charity. Secondly, many European states have concordats with the Vatican, which give the Catholic Church unique powers in relation to the state, such as the right to provide Catholic-only indoctrination in schools, and the right to demand exemptions for Catholics from laws on the grounds of conscience, that is, on the basis of Catholic dogma. There's a very useful website, www.concordatwatch.org, that has a host of fascinating detail country by country. What is most revealing is the way in which the Vatican continues to negotiate concordats, often behind closed doors, with friendly European states, and by the way, even with some who are not quite so friendly. It may come as a surprise that many of the concordats negotiated with the fascist regimes in the early 20th century are still in place, including Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and in Alsace-Lorraine. A more recent concordat has given the Church extraordinary influence in Poland since the fall of communism, and an attempted concordat with Slovakia that led to the fall of the government in 2006 hasn't been scrapped. It's just put on hold pending the return of a more Vatican-friendly government to Slovakia. These concordats are based on the anomalous status of the Holy See as a sovereign state. Between the seizure of the territory of the Papal States in 1870 and the Lateran Treaty of 1929, the Holy See was a state without any territory. But that didn't prevent the Holy See from establishing diplomatic relations with another 13 countries during that period. Governments around the world collude in the Vatican's surreal claim to be a state, and therefore entitled to privileges such as diplomatic immunity. It gave rise to the UK government's invitation to the Pope to pay a state visit to the UK this year, which caused a huge protest because of the implications that the UK taxpayer would have to bear most of the cost. Statehood gives the Holy See, uniquely among all religious institutions, the right to evade justice for crimes committed by anyone it chooses to shelter. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal in the 1980s could never be fully investigated because the bank was controlled by the Holy See. Today, the Holy See harbors Cardinal Law of Boston, wanted by the US authorities for assisting child rapists to evade justice. Pope Benedict XVI, when Cardinal Ratzinger, was also clearly implicated in the worldwide conspiracy to enable child molesters to evade justice. But as head of a sovereign state, he can never be brought to trial. In the United Kingdom, the House of Lords still has 26 unelected bishops of the Church of England able to sway and defeat government equality legislation. In the European Union, the Catholic Bishops' Conference are able to discuss and tone down impending legislation with the European Commission before even that legislation is presented to the European Parliament. In many European states, governments are enabling and funding religious indoctrination in state schools and even funding faith schools, while enabling religions to run their businesses tax-free. We're seeing politicians from Poland holding seminars in the European Parliament, arguing for the teaching of creationism as science in Europe's schools. Tony Blair, when UK Prime Minister, failed to condemn the teaching of creationism in government-funded faith schools because, quote, children need the widest possible exposure to ideas, unquote. But do they need exposure to nonsense? Isn't that a form of child abuse? What about Islam? Since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Islam has become far more assertive worldwide. And there are primarily, I think, two reasons for this. First, the Iranian Revolution showed the Muslim world that Muslims could shake off the yoke of Western economic imperialism and become the masters of their own fate. But secondly, and more importantly, Saudi Arabia suddenly woke up to the threat on its doorstep. I spoke about money earlier, and money is also the key to the new Islam. Many Islamic institutions now benefit from charitable status and the tax breaks that this brings. Some receive grants from governments for working towards social cohesion and integration, but these sums pale into insignificance compared to the billions poured into Islamic institutions all over the world by Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime is kept in place through a bargain struck with the Wahhabis, the dominant sect in Saudi Arabia. The deal is very simple. The Saudi family can enjoy their jet-setting Western lifestyle, but the quid pro quo is that they spend much of the nation's oil wealth on promoting Islam, Wahhabi Islam. According to estimates we saw back in 2004, Saudi Arabia spent between $60 and $100 billion on this project between 1980 and 2004. A process that somebody, and quite accurately in my opinion, called stealth jihad. First, they poured money into the organization of the Islamic Conference. That's the collective organization of the 57 Islamic states, which has now become the most influential power bloc in the United Nations, where they have succeeded in silencing any criticism of human rights abuse in the Islamic world. In December 2005, the OIC set out its agenda for the next 10 years, and that agenda is indistinguishable in substance, although not in tone, from the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. The program of action doesn't speak of jihad, but an example of their zero-tolerance approach to any perceived insult to Islam was their orchestration of the violent international response to the Danish cartoons. Those events were not a spontaneous outpouring of rage by a deeply offended ummah, but a planned series of attacks on Danish and other Western embassies following a decision taken at the same OIC summit in Mecca in December 2005. Now, I don't have time to say much more about the activities of the OIC at the UN, but for those of you who are interested, I'll be speaking on that subject again at a meeting on Sunday of the Danish Free Press Society here in Copenhagen. Since the early 1980s, the Saudis have been supporting local and national Islamic organizations around the world. They support the Muslim Brotherhood, CARE in the United States and Canada, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Geneva Islamic Information Center, home of the Ramadan Brothers, and a myriad mosques and Islamic information centers around the world. But most insidiously of all, they have been using their money and influence to replace liberal, moderate leadership in mosques by hardline imams. Over half of the mosques in England are now controlled by the Deoband, which is a hardline Islamist cult that originated in India. Over half of the mosques in France are now controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood and their sympathizers. And I heard just this week in Geneva that over the past 20 years, the Saudis have been quietly offering financial support to mosques in India, provided they change their imams to people selected by them. Now, I have no information on what's happening in Scandinavia, but I would be very surprised indeed if things here were any different.